In the spring of 1863, someone at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia opened a letter that should never have existed. It was March. The country was in the middle of a civil war. Most of the letters arriving at the Academy were dry reports, polite notes, requests for samples, academic gossip. But this one was different. It came marked urgent from a Union officer in Virginia. Inside was a story that sounded like madness, propaganda, or a bad joke. It spoke of a 9-year-old colored girl in a contraband camp outside Alexandria. A girl who could repeat whole medical textbooks after hearing them once, could solve complex math problems she had never been taught, could speak Latin without ever having gone to school, had corrected a doctor's medication and saved 2 soldiers' lives. For the Academy's leading expert on race science, Dr. Samuel Calicott, it was easy to dismiss. A miracle black child in a refugee camp in the middle of a war. To him, it sounded like one thing: abolitionist propaganda. So at first he laughed it off. But then a second letter came, then a third, each from different military officials, all confirming the same story, all insisting the girl was real, all adding more details about her strange abilities and the way she had diagnosed a dying man better than the camp physician himself. That was when mockery turned into something else, obsession. Because if that girl truly existed, she wasn't just a curiosity. She was a weapon aimed straight at everything he believed. Before we go deeper into the story of Eliza Davis and the scientist who tried and failed to explain her, imagine something with me for a moment. You're in a refugee camp. You've just escaped slavery. You can't read, you own nothing, and the world sees you as less than human. Now imagine your mind is sharper than any professor's. You remember every word you've ever heard, every face, every scream, every kindness, every horror, and there is no way to turn it off. If you like true historical mysteries like this, the kind that bend what we think we know about the past, make sure you subscribe and tell me in the comments which city or state you're listening from. Because our story really begins not in a university, but in the mud and smoke of a contraband camp called Relief Camp No. 7. The camp of chaos and hope. It was early 1863, just after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Thousands of men, women, and children who had escaped slavery poured into Union-held territory, hoping that blue uniforms meant safety. On the outskirts of Alexandria, Virginia, the camps grew like wild, desperate towns. Tents made of rotting canvas and torn sailcloth, walls patched with broken planks and sheets of rusted metal, fires burning day and night, the air thick with wood smoke, sweat, sickness, and the faint, sour smell of fear. Relief Camp No. 7 held about 240 people. Most of them were women and children. The men were dead, sold away, or fighting in the new United States Colored Troops regiments. Into this place, 3 weeks before the letter to Philadelphia was written, came a small girl from a burned tobacco plantation outside Richmond. Her name was Eliza Davis. A child who saw everything. Eliza was small for her age, 9 years old, thin in the way of children who have known real hunger. Her skin was dark as polished walnut, her hair braided tight under a faded calico scarf. Her face was the kind that might disappear in a crowd if you didn't look too closely. But her eyes ruined the illusion. They were wide, watchful, and unsettling, not because they were angry or wild, but because they seemed to be doing something all the time. Measuring, recording, never resting. Adults in the camp found it hard to look at her for long. It felt like she saw more than she should. She had come with an older woman named Ruth. Not her mother by blood, but something close enough. They had survived the fire together, the escape together, the journey to the Union lines together. Ruth walked with a tired, fierce energy like someone who had lost everything except the one child she refused to lose. Lieutenant Carmichael's census. The first person to notice that something about Eliza was very wrong or very right was Lieutenant James Carmichael, a young officer from Massachusetts. His job was boring and painful at the same time, counting human lives. He had been ordered to create a census of the camp. Names, ages, where people had come from, what work they could do. Most of the refugees were traumatized and illiterate. Their stories came out in broken fragments, tangled with grief and fear. On that day, Carmichael sat at a rough wooden table, his boots in the mud, a stack of forms in front of him, and a medical book at his elbow, Gray's Anatomy, which he'd been reading in hopes of understanding the camp's constant sickness. "Next," he called. A thin girl in a worn dress stepped forward with her eyes downcast. Ruth hovered behind her like a shield. "Name?" Carmichael asked. "Eliza, sir," she whispered. "Family name?" "Davis, sir. That was Master's name." "Age?" 9 years, sir. Born in spring of '54. He wrote this down automatically. On the table, Gray's Anatomy lay open to a drawing of the human heart, its chambers and vessels labeled in Latin. He noticed the girl's eyes flick to the page and then stay there. She didn't just glance at the picture. She stared at it the way starving people stare at food. "Can you read, girl?" he asked, already knowing what the answer should be. Teaching enslaved people to read was illegal in the South. It was punished hard. Eliza hesitated. Ruth tensed behind her. "It's all right," Carmichael said, lowering his voice. "You're free now. There's no punishment for learning here." "No, sir," Eliza whispered. "I can't read, but I can see the pictures. What do you see?" Her hand lifted toward the page, then stopped, like she was afraid the paper might burn her. "That's the heart, sir. The aorta carries blood from the ventriculus, sinister the left ventricle to the body. The vena cava brings it back. The right side sends blood to the lungs through the arteria pulmonalis." Carmichael dropped his pen. Those were not camp words, or soldier words, or plantation words. They were words from the book on his table. "How do you know those terms?" he demanded. Eliza finally looked up, and in her face he saw not pride or excitement, but something else. Resignation. Like she had known this moment was coming and dreaded it. "Master's son was studying to be a doctor, sir, before the war," she said softly. "He used to read his books out loud to remember them better. I'd be cleaning his room while he studied. And you just memorized them, from hearing them." "I remember everything I hear, sir. Every word. Testing the impossible." For the next hour, Carmichael forgot his forms completely. He turned the tent into a crude laboratory. He called over other refugees and had them talk while Eliza sat quietly nearby. Then he asked her to repeat what they had said. She did word for word. Their exact accents, their grammar, even when they spoke in German or French. Then he opened Gray's Anatomy and read aloud complex descriptions of organs and systems, long paragraphs thick with Latin and medical terms. Eliza repeated all of it back flawlessly. That alone would have been unbelievable. But then he asked the one question that changed everything. "Do you understand what any of this means?" She did, not like someone reciting a song, not like a trained parrot. She explained the circulatory system in simple language, using the technical terms correctly. She described how blood carried life through the body, what the lungs did, how the heart worked. When Carmichael mentioned that one of the camp doctors was puzzled by a patient's strange symptoms, Eliza asked 3 clear, focused questions. Did the man's gums bleed easily? Did he have joint pain? Was he badly underfed? Then she said quietly, "It sounds like scurvy, sir. Pleurisy, they sometimes call it. Made worse by hunger. He needs fresh food if you can give it and certain medicines, not bleeding." The diagnosis was right. The treatment worked. A man who should have died lived. And suddenly, the rumors in that muddy camp had a new center. A little girl in a grey dress who listened like no one else and who remembered like no one else. A dangerous kind of proof. Within a week, Carmichael's report crawled its way up the military chain of command. Camp Commanding Officer, Department of War in Washington. In 1863, this was more than just a curiosity. It was dangerous. Because if Eliza was real, she wasn't just a gifted child. She was living, breathing proof that the science used to justify slavery was built on sand. For decades, white scholars had insisted that black people were naturally less intelligent, suited only for hard labor, incapable of high reasoning. Even many white abolitionists believed black people were less advanced, just worthy of freedom and dignity anyway. But a 9-year-old black girl who had grown up in slavery with no formal schooling, who could outthink trained doctors and officers, that did not fit anyone's theory. The government understood the risk. If abolitionists learned about her, she would become a powerful symbol. If Confederate sympathizers learned about her, they would want her silenced permanently. So the Department of War did the one thing that made sense to the men in charge. They brought in a scientist to quietly investigate. The man sent to disprove her. On April 3rd, 1863, the request landed on the desk of Dr. Samuel Calicott, age 47, respected member of the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. He was not just any scientist. He was one of the country's leading experts in craniology, the science of measuring skulls to judge intelligence and race. He had spent years publishing measurements and charts that proved black skulls were smaller in the front, the area he claimed controlled higher thinking, and that their brains were closer to apes than white humans. Slaveholders loved his work. Politicians quoted him. His papers appeared in books defending slavery. To a man like this, Eliza represented one of two things: a silly rumor he could easily crush, or a threat big enough to destroy his career forever. The War Department's instructions were clear and chilling. Examine the girl in complete secrecy. Share your findings only with certain officials. Do not let the public learn she exists. Above all, keep her under control. Calicott packed his instruments: calipers for skull measurements, charts and tables for intelligence, notebooks full of racial theories. He brought a young assistant, William Driscoll, and a stenographer to record everything. On a grey, rainy morning, Samuel Calicott arrived at Relief Camp No. 7. He expected to find a clever child and a simple explanation. What he found instead would break him. And somewhere in that camp, a small girl with a blue ribbon in her hair was waiting not for a savior, but for the man who would decide whether she lived as a person or as a specimen. Rain clung to every surface of Camp Relief No. 7. The morning doctor, Samuel Calicott, arrived, a cold, steady drizzle that turned paths into mud and tents into sagging pockets of damp canvas. The camp's physician, Dr. Marcus Lindley, greeted him with a skeptical glare, the kind reserved for men who lived in clean cities and clean theories, not mud-soaked reality. As they walked past rows of coughing refugees and soldiers with hollow eyes, Lindley explained carefully that the girl was remarkable beyond anything in his medical experience. Calicott responded with polite dismissal, insisting that every strange talent had a rational explanation: heightened memory, mimicry, accidental training. Some individuals of inferior races, he added without shame, can be conditioned to repeat complex tasks without true understanding. A parrot speaks, doctor, but does not comprehend. Lindley's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. They reached a small tent used as a temporary isolation room. Inside, the air was close, heavy with the lingering scent of carbolic acid and damp wool. A small figure sat on a cot, hands folded in her lap. Eliza Davis looked up as the men entered, and her expression was neither fearful nor timid, simply alert, watchful, almost wary. Her guardian, Ruth, sat silently in the corner, eyes filled with the same quiet exhaustion seen throughout the camp. Calicott inspected the girl with clinical detachment, scribbling notes on her size, posture, and skull shape. Nothing unusual. Nothing that could possibly justify the absurd stories sent to his desk. She looked like any other freed child, thin from hunger, shoulders tense, a life's worth of caution behind her eyes. Then she spoke. "Good morning, Dr. Calicott," she said softly. "Doctor, Lindley mentioned you studied in Edinburgh under Robert Knox. I heard him read some of your papers. You believe Negro skull capacity averages 5 cubic inches less than Caucasians, especially in the frontal region linked to reasoning." Calicott froze mid-step. The girl's voice was quiet, but each word landed with precise clarity. He stared at her. "How do you know where I studied?" he demanded. Eliza lowered her eyes. "Dr. Lindley told Lieutenant Carmichael yesterday, at 2:47 in the afternoon, when the wind was blowing from the east." She said it as if it were obvious, as if anyone could hear conversations happening 200 yards away inside a closed medical tent. For the next 6 hours, Calicott transformed from arrogant skeptic to shaken witness. He began with memory tests, reading paragraphs from medical texts in English, Latin, and German. Eliza recited each passage word for word, including corrections for the mistakes he thought she wouldn't notice. He tested comprehension, expecting the child to falter, but she didn't. She explained complex medical mechanisms as though she'd studied for years. When he read philosophical arguments from Kant, she not only understood them but pointed out logical weaknesses. When he presented advanced mathematics, she solved problems before he finished writing them. Twice she corrected him gently, even apologetically when he miscopied a number. His assistant, Driscoll, grew pale as the hours passed. Nothing they tested revealed a boundary. The girl had none. By late afternoon, Calicott's scientific detachment was cracking. His hands trembled slightly each time he handed her a new problem. Every test that had once reinforced his theories now tore at their foundations. He shifted to physical examinations, desperate for some anatomical aberration to explain the impossible. He measured her skull with calipers, checking frontal angles, cranial breadth, and orbital spacing, but each statistic fell perfectly normal. No extra folds, no deformities, no anomalies, nothing that justified her abilities or his life's work. Driscoll whispered, "Sir, what if the theories themselves are wrong?" Calicott snapped that decades of data did not crumble because of one anomalous child. But the words sounded hollow, even to him. As dusk settled over the camp, a strange calm filled the small tent. Eliza sat quietly, not triumphant, not frightened, simply waiting. Calicott forced one last test, an impossible geometric problem he'd selected years ago to challenge university students. He placed the parchment in front of her. She studied it for 15 seconds, then looked up with deep sadness, as if the answer itself pained her. "There is no solution," she said softly. "The assumptions contradict the conclusion. It isn't a math problem, sir. It's a trap." And with that, the last barrier of his certainty crumbled. Samuel Calicott walked out of the tent shaken, his notebook filled with contradictions, his theories slipping through his fingers like sand. The camp lanterns flickered in the darkening wind as he tried to steady his breath. All around him were the faces of freed people, men, women, and children. he had spent a lifetime insisting were intellectually inferior. But in that tent was a child who could shatter everything he believed, a child whose mind could change the world or destroy her if the wrong people found out. It was in that moment, soaked in rain and disbelief, that Dr. Samuel Calicott understood the truth he wasn't ready to admit. This girl was not an anomaly. She was the proof his science was built on lies. And somewhere deep inside him, a fear began to grow, not of Eliza, but of the world that would want to own her once they learned what she could do. That night, long after the examinations ended, the camp had settled into its usual uneasy quiet, the kind that never fully relaxed, even in the safety of Union lines. Lanterns flickered weakly in the rain-soaked wind. Soldiers passed between tents in tired rotations, and somewhere in the distance, a child cried in its sleep. Dr. Calicott sat alone in the small room assigned to him, staring at his notes, trying to find some thread of logic that could explain what he had witnessed. Every line, every test result, every observation contradicted 20 years of his life's research. He had dedicated himself to proving that intellect was biologically stratified by race, that cranial capacity determined human potential. Yet a 9-year-old black girl had dismantled his scientific certainty in a single afternoon. He tried to salvage his theories by rewriting his notes, searching for patterns, anomalies, anything that could file Eliza under exception rather than evidence of error. But the words on the page mocked him. Every attempt to rationalize her abilities collapsed under its own weight. At last, frustrated and exhausted, he blew out his candle and stepped outside for air. The night was thick with mist and the smell of mud and wood smoke. He heard muffled coughing from the infirmary tent, the distant crackle of a dying fire, and something else. A voice, high and soft, speaking in a language he hadn't heard in years. Latin. Perfect, clear Latin. He followed the sound toward the medical tent, confusion tightening his steps. Inside, he found Dr. Lindley leaning over a dying soldier whose leg wound had turned black and swollen. 2 orderlies held the man down as he thrashed in feverish agony. And there, standing beside them, barefoot on the cold dirt floor, was Eliza Davis. Her small hands were steady, her voice surprisingly calm as she instructed Lindley to locate areas of crepitus, the crackling tissue beneath the skin that signaled the presence of deadly gas-forming bacteria. She spoke quickly, naming terms in Latin, then translating them into English with the same precision she showed during the day. Lindley saw Calicott and shook his head helplessly. "She says it's gangrene moving into the bloodstream," he muttered. "We plan to amputate at sunrise, but she insists we won't make it that long." Eliza turned to Calicott, her eyes dark and unblinking. "He will die before morning, sir," she said. "You can feel the red lines the infection is traveling. You can clean the wound with a carbolic solution. Dr. Lister wrote about it last year. I heard you reading it when you weren't careful about the tent flap being closed." Her voice trembled slightly, not with fear, but with urgency. Calicott stared at her. "Carbolic acid is untested," he argued. "Most surgeons reject it. It's dangerous." "He will die anyway," Eliza replied softly. "This gives him a chance." There was no arrogance in her voice, no pride, only certainty, and fear not for herself, but for the man on the bed whose life hung between 2 impossible options: the accepted medical wisdom of the day, or the instinct of a child who should not have known any of this. Lindley looked at Calicott, silently begging for direction, and in that moment, the scientist who spent his life insisting that black children could not reason, could not analyze, could not think beyond imitation, heard himself say the words, "Try it." What followed was 2 hours of agony. The carbolic solution burned like fire. The soldier screamed until his voice tore. The orderlies held him down while Lindley cut away rotten flesh, following Eliza's instructions to go deeper, farther, more aggressively than he believed safe. Calicott stood rigid in the corner, watching his own world collapse as he realized that the child he came to debunk was saving a man's life using knowledge not yet accepted by modern medicine. By dawn, the soldier's fever broke. The red lymph lines stopped creeping upward. Against all expectation, he lived. Eliza sat quietly on a stool, her small frame shaking with exhaustion. Ruth stood behind her, gently rubbing her shoulders. Lindley leaned against the tent pole, stunned and pale. Calicott felt something cold and irreversible settle in his chest, the awareness that this child was no anomaly to be dismissed, no curiosity to be catalogued. She was living proof that his science was built on lies. Worse still, she was proof that the world did not deserve her. Outside, the first faint light crept across the muddy camp. Soldiers began waking, unaware that the most extraordinary mind in America had just rewritten the fate of a dying man. Eliza looked at Calicott with eyes far too old for a child. "I didn't mean to frighten you, sir," she whispered. "I just didn't want him to die." Calicott could not answer. For the first time in his career, he had no theory, no chart, no measurement to protect him. Only a single terrifying realization: this girl was not just exceptional, she was vulnerable. And if the wrong people learned what she could do, they would tear her life apart to understand how. In that dawn-lit tent, Dr. Samuel Calicott took a breath that trembled in his chest. He did not yet know it, but his next decisions would determine whether Eliza Davis lived freely or vanished into the hands of men far more dangerous than he ever was. The sun had barely lifted above the ragged tents when Dr. Samuel Calicott received the message that changed the tone of the entire investigation. A courier arrived on horseback, mud splashing up the sides of the animal's legs, carrying a sealed envelope stamped with the crest of the United States War Department. The young soldier saluted rigidly, then left without a word. Calicott broke the seal slowly, expecting a polite inquiry or a request for early observations. Instead, the letter contained 5 clipped sentences: cold, clinical, and dangerous. He was ordered to continue examining the girl without interruption. He was forbidden from discussing his findings with anyone outside a short list of military officials. He was instructed to assess the full range of her abilities, determine her limitations, and evaluate potential applications. And the final line delivered the blow he feared. Under no circumstances is this subject to be allowed contact with unauthorized persons. Public knowledge of her existence would be detrimental to national interests. The clinical wording masked its meaning, but Calicott understood it perfectly. The government didn't see Eliza as a child. They saw a strategic asset, or a threat. Something that needed to be controlled, studied, possibly used. He felt the letter's weight tightening around his throat like an invisible rope. Just hours earlier, he had watched her save a soldier's life with knowledge she should not have had. He had seen her hands tremble afterward, not with pride, but with the shock of being pulled yet again into adult suffering she never asked for. And now the War Department wanted more, demanded more, expected more. They were already imagining what her mind could be worth to science, to politics, to power. And children with value were rarely allowed to remain children. The rest of that day passed like a slow breaking storm. Calicott resumed the examinations, this time under the shadow of government pressure. Armed guards began lingering near the tent where Eliza stayed, pretending casual duty, but keeping a watchful eye. Ruth felt the change immediately and hovered closer to the girl, her face tightening every time a soldier passed too near. Eliza sensed it too. Her posture was straighter, her voice quieter, her eyes moving constantly as if measuring danger she could not name aloud. When Calicott asked her to perform tasks she had easily mastered the day before, mental arithmetic, Latin translation, identifying chemical structures, she did them flawlessly. But there was no spark of curiosity now, no eager precision, only a muted obedience, as if she were returning to the survival posture she learned on the plantation. Be useful, be silent, stay alive. And yet, her brilliance could not be hidden behind fear. When Calicott attempted to test the limits of her memory by reading a series of obscure astronomical calculations, Eliza corrected him mid-sentence, noting an error in the text itself. His assistant Driscoll watched her with something that was not admiration or fear, but greed. An academic greed, the kind that sees human beings as doorways to professional fame. Each time she answered a question too quickly, he scribbled faster. Each time she revealed an insight no child should possess, his eyes flashed with excitement. At one point, when she solved a mathematical sequence faster than any scholar Calicott had ever met, Driscoll muttered under his breath. If the world saw this, everything would change. Calicott heard him, and something inside him hardened. He had spent decades believing in false hierarchies of intellect, comforting lies dressed in scientific measurements. But now he saw a different hierarchy forming, the hierarchy of those who wanted to own Eliza. Driscoll's excitement was not innocent curiosity. It was hunger. The War Department's orders, the guards outside her tent, the whispers spreading through the camp, all pointed to one truth. Eliza was becoming a possession, not a person. That evening, while the camp settled into dinner, Calicott found himself unable to eat. He walked instead to the outskirts of the camp, where the forest pressed close and the shadows grew long. He needed air, space to think, to steady his racing pulse. Every direction he turned in his mind led to the same dark wall. If he reported the truth about Eliza, the government would take her. If he lied, he would destroy his career and reputation forever. If he tried to protect her publicly, she would become a symbol, hunted by Confederates who would fear her, and exploited by abolitionists who would want to display her. A child who remembered everything would have no place to hide. When he returned to the camp's medical tent later that night, he found Dr. Lindley alone, washing his instruments. The man's face looked worn, not from sleep deprivation, but from the weight of what he had witnessed that morning. Without looking up, Lindley said quietly, "That girl is extraordinary, Calicott. Not just bright, something far beyond that. If the department wants to use her, they'll break her." Calicott swallowed hard. "What would you have me do?" "Tell the truth," Lindley said, "or tell a version of it that protects her." "And risk my entire profession?" "Better your profession than her life." The words struck him harder than he expected. Calicott turned away, pretending to examine a jar on the shelf, unwilling to let Lindley see the cracks forming inside him. The truth was simple and brutal. He had the authority to protect Eliza. He was the one man whose report could bury her or expose her. And yet he felt profoundly unworthy of that responsibility. He had spent his life contributing to the very system that would destroy her. When he left the tent, he found Eliza sitting on a wooden box outside, her small hands cupped around a tin mug of tea Ruth had given her. The lantern's glow caught her features just enough to show the fatigue in her eyes. But when she looked up at Calicott, he saw something else there too. Fear held carefully behind silence. Are you all right?" he asked softly. She hesitated before answering, as if choosing her words with painful precision. "Everyone is looking at me today, sir, like they want something." Her voice was too calm, too practiced. It was the voice of a child who had learned to study the moods of adults to survive. Calicott knelt beside her. The ground was cold and wet, and his coat soaked up the mud, but he didn't care. "Eliza," he said gently, "I need you to tell me if you feel unsafe." She considered the question, then lifted her gaze to his with a quiet honesty that hurt to witness. "I don't feel in danger yet," she whispered. but I feel watched. And when grown men watch a child too closely, it never means something good. The truth of that sentence struck him like a blow. That night, after she was escorted back to her tent, Calicott returned to his quarters and stared at the War Department's orders lying on his table. He read them again and again until the ink blurred. There was no mercy in them, no humanity, only cold utility. They wanted a mind they could use. They wanted a child they could own. By midnight, he knew the reports he was expected to write. Clinical, precise, truthful, would become the weapon that destroyed her. And he also knew, with a clarity that settled like ice in his bones, that he would not allow that to happen. The next morning, when the sun rose over Camp Relief No. 7, Dr. Samuel Calicott had made his choice, a choice that would cost him everything. But a choice that would give Eliza her only chance to live. The next days unfolded with a strange mixture of urgency and dread, as if the entire camp were holding its breath. Dr. Calicott intensified the examinations, trying to satisfy the expectations of the War Department without pushing Eliza into the kind of intellectual exhaustion he had witnessed before. But every test, every question, every demonstration of her abilities, 'tis only deepened his terror. She solved problems meant for university scholars in seconds. She translated Latin passages she had heard only once, years ago, with perfect fluency. She could recite entire conversations she had overheard from tents 200 yards away, recalling exact tones, hesitations, and accents. And yet, each time she answered, her voice grew quieter, as if she knew her gifts were drawing her closer to danger rather than freedom. By the third day, Eliza no longer waited for the next question. She anticipated them. She sat stiffly on her cot, hands folded in her lap, her eyes flicking from Calicott to the stenographer to Driscoll as though she were cataloguing each man's intentions. Children who have lived through violence learn to read adults not by their words, but by their breathing, by the tension in their shoulders, by the shape of silence around them. Eliza read all of it. She knew that something dark was closing in. Ruth, who never left her side, felt it too. The older woman watched the guards who had started lingering near the tent. She noticed the way officers paused when they passed, whispering behind gloved hands. She noticed how quickly Driscoll arrived each morning, hungry for every new display of genius. Ruth didn't have Eliza's perfect memory, but she had the memory of a woman who had survived slavery. She recognized the early signs of people deciding they owned something. One evening, after hours of examinations, Dr. Lindley asked Calicott to stay behind. The medical tent was dimly lit, the lantern throwing trembling shadows across the canvas walls. Lindley spoke quietly, as if afraid the night itself might overhear. "She's losing weight," he said. "She barely sleeps. When she does, she wakes screaming, though she tries to hide it. You're wearing her thin, Calicott. And for what? To satisfy bureaucrats who see her as a tool?" Calicott pressed his palms into the edge of the table, feeling the rough wood bite into his skin. "The examinations are required," he said weakly. "Required by whom?" Lindley snapped. "Men who've never seen this camp, men who don't know what she's survived. They want her because she's extraordinary, not because they care about her life. You understand this, don't you?" Calicott didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was written all over his face. Later that night, he visited Eliza again. The camp was quiet. A thin fog curled over the wet ground. Inside her tent, she sat reading a small primer, the only book simple enough to be given to freedmen children. She wasn't turning pages at a normal pace. Her eyes barely skimmed before she closed the book again, her mind storing every sentence perfectly. When she saw him, she straightened reflexively, the way enslaved children learn to expect either orders or punishment when an adult enters a room. Calicott knelt near her cot, lowering himself to her level. Eliza watched him with steady, unreadable eyes. "Eliza," he said carefully, "I want to ask you something." She didn't answer, but her expression softened enough to show she was listening. "Do you understand what's happening? Why these questions keep coming?" For a moment, she was silent. Then she closed the primer on her lap and placed her hands neatly over it. "I understand that people like knowing things they don't understand," she said, "and they want to keep the thing that scares them close so they can control it." Her voice was calm, but the words struck him like a blow. "Do you think we're trying to control you?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded once, small, almost apologetic, but honest. "You're kinder than the others," she whispered, "but you're afraid of what I can do, afraid of what it means for your books and your charts, afraid of what other men will do if you tell them the truth." She lifted her eyes to him, and the rawness in them nearly broke him. "But I'm afraid too, sir," she added. "I hear soldiers talking. I hear the way the officers whisper. They think I'm not listening, but I always hear. They say the government will want me. They say I could be useful. Useful is a dangerous word for a colored child, Dr. Calicott." He could not deny it. Then, almost as if she sensed the moment he broke, her voice grew softer, more fragile than he had ever heard it. "I remember everything, sir," she said. "Everything from before. Every scream, every face, every time someone hurt someone else. I remember hearing babies taken from their mothers. I remember the crack of the whip. I remember my brother's voice when they sold him. I can't forget any of it. When most people get scared, they forget a little. I never forget anything." Her voice wavered. "Sometimes I wish my mind didn't hold so much." Those words lodged themselves deep inside him, carrying a grief he could not bear. A perfect memory wasn't a blessing. It was a prison she carried inside her skull, a weight no child should bear. Ruth, half awake in the corner, wiped her eyes without speaking. Calicott felt the last of his scientific pride peel away. In its place grew something sharp and protective, something he had not felt in years. Human responsibility. She was not an anomaly to be documented. She was a child, drowning in her own brilliance, and the world would devour her if he allowed it. "Eliza," he whispered, voice raw, "I promise you this. I will not let them take you away." She looked at him with a sadness far older than her 9 years. "They already want to," she murmured. "I hear it in their footsteps." At that moment, Calicott understood the truth with terrifying clarity. Unless he lied, magnificently, deliberately, bravely, Eliza Davis would not survive the month. Her mind was too extraordinary, too valuable, too dangerous for the world to leave untouched. And so the scientist who had come to disprove her made his choice. He would betray the War Department. He would falsify his own research. He would destroy the very theories that had made him famous. He would lie to save her life, even if it cost him his own Dot. The morning after his promise to Eliza, Dr. Samuel Calicott woke with a pounding ache behind his eyes, the kind that comes not from sickness, but from realizing your entire world has shifted while you slept. His cot felt harder, the air colder, the distant sounds of camp life sharper, almost intrusive. Children coughing, pots clattering, the muffled groans of wounded soldiers. Normal sounds of war, but today they felt like reminders of something heavier, the choices he now faced. He dressed with shaky hands and walked toward the examination tent, each step weighted by a gnawing dread. Inside, the War Department's orders lay rolled on his desk, the ink already familiar enough to haunt him. Determine the extent of the subject's abilities. Maintain secrecy. Evaluate potential applications. Do not allow public knowledge. These were not instructions. They were shackles, and if he obeyed them honestly, they would become a noose around a child's life. By midday, Driscoll and the stenographer had returned to take more notes. Soldiers hovered in the background with thinly disguised curiosity. Even some officers lingered outside the tent, whispering about the gifted little Negro girl, as if she were an oddity in a traveling show. Every whisper tightened something inside Calicott's chest. He realized then that whatever he wrote would spread beyond the camp up through the military, into the scientific community, into newspapers hungry for sensational stories. A 9-year-old child could not survive the spotlight they would shine on her. So, when the examinations began again, he conducted them without the sharpness of the previous days. He deliberately chose simpler tasks. He avoided questions that might expose the full brilliance of her mind. But Eliza, with her devastating perceptiveness, understood instantly. At one point, after answering a deliberately easy problem, she looked up and whispered, "Sir, why are you pretending?" The words nearly broke him. While the afternoon tests continued, Calicott excused himself and fled to the small writing desk in his quarters. His fingers trembled as he dipped his pen in ink. For years he had written reports with confidence, with the certainty of a man who believed he was documenting objective truths. Today he wrote with the weight of a man committing treason not against his country, but against the institution that had shaped his career. The first line of the report was a lie. The second line was a deeper lie. By the fifth line, the lies felt like blows. The subject's remarkable memory appears limited to rote repetition. No substantial comprehension of advanced material is demonstrated. Observed abilities likely result from mimicry, not reasoning. Further study is unnecessary and not recommended. Each sentence was crafted with cold precision, built to bury her brilliance under the weight of mediocrity. He worded it as he knew bureaucrats like dull, technical, dismissive. A report that would land on a desk, be skimmed, and be forgotten. As he wrote, a sickening guilt crept into him. His entire career had been dedicated to truth, even if that truth was built on flawed science. Now he was corrupting his own words to save a child. But when he imagined Eliza being taken away in the dead of night, a specimen, not a girl, the guilt melted into resolve. He pressed the pen harder, writing faster. No. By dusk, the report was complete. He read it once more, forcing himself to believe the lie he'd created. Then he sealed it, placed his name and professional reputation beneath the final sentence, and folded it with a trembling exhale. It was the most cowardly, most courageous thing he had ever done. Driscoll found him shortly afterward. The young assistant held the report with shaking hands, his face white with disbelief. "Sir," he whispered, "this isn't what she is. This isn't even close to the truth. You're throwing away everything you've worked for." Calicott closed his eyes. "I know." "You're lying," Driscoll said, his voice rising. "If you publish this, it will ruin your credibility. People will say you misjudged her, or that you were incompetent, or that you hid something. Is her life worth your career?" Calicott opened his eyes. In them was a clarity he had not felt in years. "A career built on falsehood deserves to end," he said quietly. "She deserves a life, and I will not watch her be destroyed because men like me once believed the color of her skin measured the size of her mind." Driscoll stared at him, stricken. Then anger crept into his expression, righteous, wounded, dangerous anger. "You don't get to decide that truth doesn't matter," he said. "Science matters. Knowledge matters. And children matter more," Calicott replied. For a moment, Driscoll looked as if he might tear the report in half, but instead he set it down with trembling fingers and walked out of the tent, shoulders stiff, jaw clenched. That night, after turning in the fabricated report, Calicott returned to Eliza's tent. She sat curled under a thin blanket, her eyes wide open in the dark. Ruth dozed beside her. When he stepped inside, Eliza blinked once, not startled, but expectant. "Did it work?" she whispered. He knelt beside her cot. "I hope so," he murmured. "I wrote that you're unremarkable, that your abilities were overstated, that no one needs to study you further." She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she asked, very quietly, "Will they stop looking at me like I'm dangerous?" He wanted to promise yes. He wanted to reassure her. But the truth was a shadow he couldn't banish, so he told her the only thing he could honestly say. "I will do everything in my power," he whispered. "Everything." For the first time since he met her, she let herself lean against him just slightly, just enough to show trust. Her small hand rested against his sleeve. Her breathing softened. Outside, the camp winds carried the distant rhythm of footsteps and murmurings of soldiers changing shifts. Life went on, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But inside that tent, a 9-year-old prodigy and a disgraced scientist shared a fragile, stolen moment of safety, both unaware that forces beyond the camp were already moving toward them. Forces that had heard whispers, rumors, stories of a gifted black child who remembered everything. Forces that would not be deterred by a forged report. Soon they would come. And when they did, Calicott's lies would not be enough. For a few days after the report was submitted, the camp seemed to exhale. The guards still lingered, but with less intensity. Officers no longer paused near Eliza's tent. Driscoll stopped attending the examinations altogether, avoiding Calicott with an increasingly brittle politeness. Calicott allowed himself to believe briefly, foolishly, that the worst had passed. That his lie had brought Eliza the safety she desperately needed. But peace in wartime was always fragile. And for Eliza, fragile peace was as dangerous as open threats. It began as a single rumor. A passing murmur among soldiers near the supply wagon. A low voice saying, "That's the one, the little doctor girl." Another voice replying, "War Department sending someone to confirm it." The words were tossed casually, like gossip about rations or promotions. But to a child who remembered everything she heard, they were warnings carved deep into bone. Eliza didn't tell Ruth at first. She observed. She listened. She watched how certain men, unfamiliar to the camp, appeared near the medical tent and lingered too long when she passed. She saw how a Union officer, wearing a coat too clean for field duty, appeared each morning, always within sight of her. He never spoke to her, never approached, but his eyes followed her with unnerving focus. She knew the look. It was the look of someone evaluating property. One evening she approached Calicott quietly while he was reviewing notes he no longer believed in. She stood just inside the tent, her shadow trembling against the candlelight. "Dr. Calicott," she whispered, "I think someone new is watching me." He looked up sharply. "Who?" "I don't know his name," she said, voice soft and steady. "Tall, clean coat, badge polished. He watches like he's measuring something. Measuring me." Calicott's stomach tightened. He stood, pulled aside the tent flap, and scanned the camp. Soldiers gathered near fires. A few officers crossed the muddy path on evening rounds. Nothing seemed unusual. But he had learned enough to trust Eliza's instincts. A child with her memory didn't mistake a glance for surveillance. That night, long after the camp quieted, Calicott visited Driscoll, who was sitting alone with a stack of medical books he pretended to read. Driscoll avoided meeting his eyes. "Why are you here?" he asked flatly. "Someone has come to verify the report," Calicott said. "Who did you speak to?" Driscoll stiffened. His fingers tightened around the book's spine. "I told you before. No one important. Just a researcher at a conference. You said too much, Calicott snapped. Someone from Washington is here. Someone who doesn't believe what I wrote, and someone who wants the girl. Driscoll's face went pale. That wasn't my intention. Intentions don't matter. Actions do. For the first time since the examinations began, Driscoll looked truly afraid. What if they take her, sir? What if— They will, Calicott cut in, voice low and cold, unless we get her out. Quietly. Soon. Driscoll opened his mouth, but no words came. His guilt was carved so plainly across his face that Calicott felt a brief flicker of pity before it hardened again into resolve. He left Driscoll and found Ruth, who was sitting beside a small fire with Eliza asleep against her side. Ruth looked up with that weary, instinctive protectiveness he had come to recognize. Her arms tightened around the girl without thinking. "What is it?" she whispered. Calicott sat across from her, the firelight catching the deep lines of exhaustion on his face. "Ruth," he said quietly, "you were right to be afraid. Someone knows about her. Someone important." Ruth's breath hitched. She looked down at Eliza, brushing a hand across the girl's hair. "Are they coming for her?" "Yes," Calicott admitted, "and when they do, they won't ask politely." Ruth's eyes filled with a kind of fear that was not loud or panicked, but silent and deadly, born from a lifetime of knowing what white men could take if they wanted something badly enough. "What do we do?" she whispered. Calicott leaned closer. "I can smuggle you out, both of you. But we must leave before morning. If you stay, she will disappear into a place you will never find her again." Ruth looked down at Eliza's sleeping face, so peaceful in the glow of the fire, unaware that her fate balanced on the edge of a knife. She bowed her head, letting silent tears fall into the girl's hair. But before she could answer, a sudden crack of a branch snapped behind them. Both adults froze. A shadow moved behind a supply tent. Then another. Eliza stirred in her sleep, sensing the tension even before waking. Ruth clutched her tighter. Calicott stood, heart pounding. "Ruth," he breathed, "wake her, slowly, and don't say my name." More footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving closer. Someone was approaching. Someone who wasn't part of the camp. Someone who had been waiting for nightfall. Eliza opened her eyes, instantly alert, instantly understanding the danger without a word spoken. She whispered only one sentence as the shadows drew closer. "They found me." The shadow moved closer, slow and deliberate, like someone confident they had already won. Calicott stepped instinctively in front of Ruth and Eliza, though he knew he was no soldier. The fire crackled between them and the darkness, throwing pale, jittering light across the wet ground. For a moment, nothing happened. The night held its breath. Then a man emerged, tall, thin, wearing a long coat far too clean for the camp. His spectacles glinted in the firelight. He looked like a clerk, or a schoolteacher, or a doctor. Someone civilized. Someone dangerous. "Evening," he said calmly, adjusting his gloves. "I'm looking for a child." Calicott felt every muscle in his body freeze. "This camp is closed to outside visitors," he said, keeping his voice even. "State your business." The man smiled politely, the kind of polite that masked cruelty. "My business," he said, "is in the name of the United States government. I understand there is a girl here with exceptional qualities." His eyes shifted past Calicott and landed directly on Eliza. In that single glance, Eliza's breath caught. She remembered his voice, his coat, the faint scent of ink and tobacco she'd heard drifting from a distance days before. "I've seen him," she whispered, trembling. "By the road, 3 times. Ruth pulled her close. Calicott set his jaw. "You have no authority here, and no right to question a child." Leave this camp at once." But the man didn't move. He tilted his head slightly, studying Calicott the way a collector studies an artifact. "Dr. Samuel Calicott," he murmured, "your reputation precedes you. So does your false report." The words sliced through the air like a blade. "I know who she is," he continued, "and I know what she can do. You cannot hide this kind of brilliance, not from men who understand its worth." Calicott stepped closer, fury shaking through him. "She is a child. She's not yours to take. She's not an object." "No," the man said softly, "but she is a national curiosity, and curiosities belong to those who can best use them." The world seemed to tilt. Ruth clutched Eliza so tightly the girl winced. Calicott felt something bitter and broken crack inside him. He had been too late. The lie, the report, the secrecy, all of it had only delayed the inevitable. Then voices rose suddenly, soldiers shouting in the distance, boots pounding against the mud, more shadows moving between the tents. Not one man, not two, a team, the extraction team, the ones who would take her. Ruth's voice trembled. "Dr. Calicott, do something." He grabbed Eliza's hand. "Run." That single word snapped the night in half. They sprinted through the maze of tents, their feet splashing through mud, Eliza's small hand gripping his with desperate strength. Ruth followed close behind, her breath sharp and panicked. Lanterns swung wildly as soldiers turned, startled, unsure whether to intervene. "Stop them!" the man's voice bellowed behind them. "Do not let the girl escape." But Eliza, even terrified, was sharper than anyone chasing her. She tugged Calicott sharply left toward the medical tent, not away from danger, but toward chaos. "They won't look here first," she gasped. "They avoid the sick tents. They don't like the smell." She was right. They slipped inside the tent, ducking behind a stack of supply crates. The smell of disinfectant and infected wounds hung thick in the air. Lanterns flickered softly. Outside, men shouted orders, their boots thudding past. Calicott crouched beside her, his heart pounding so violently he could barely breathe. Ruth knelt on Eliza's other side, stroking the girl's hair, whispering prayers under her breath. Minutes passed. Footsteps moved away. The search spread outward. "We can still get you out," Calicott whispered. "If we get to the far side of the camp, I can—" But before he finished, Eliza shook her head. "They won't stop, not after tonight. If I run now, they'll chase me forever, and they'll hurt the people helping me." Her eyes lifted to him with an anguish he had never seen. "I heard you and Driscoll fighting," she whispered. "He told someone important." Calicott felt his blood go cold. "Eliza." "I know what happens next," she said softly. "I've heard these stories my whole life. People with power don't lose interest. They take what they want." Her small hand trembled in his. "If they take me now, Ruth will die trying to stop them. You might die too. I don't want that." Calicott's voice shook. "I won't let them take you." She looked at him with heartbreaking gentleness. "You can't stop them, sir. Not alone." Outside, boots shifted. A whisper, a metal latch clicking open. Someone entering the tent. Ruth's breath stilled. Calicott felt his pulse explode in his ears. Eliza closed her eyes. A hand gripped Calicott's collar and yanked him backward. Two soldiers surged into the tent, overpowering him before he could shout. Ruth screamed and lunged, but another soldier caught her around the waist, dragging her back. "No!" Calicott roared, fighting wildly. "Let her go! She's a child!" But Eliza did not scream. She did not fight. She only looked at him, with those ancient, knowing eyes full of sorrow and apology, and something like acceptance. "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered as the soldiers took her arms. "I didn't want you to get hurt." Eliza! He reached for her, fingertips brushing hers for the briefest second before they pulled her away. Her small hand slipped from his like a thread snapping in the dark. Ruth collapsed into sobs. Eliza disappeared through the tent flap. And then she was gone, swallowed by the night, swallowed by the system, swallowed by the men who believed brilliance was theirs to own. The last thing Calicott heard as they forced him to the ground was Eliza's voice, carried faintly on the wind. "I will remember you." And she did, until the story disappeared, until she disappeared, until the world forgot she ever lived. Dr. Samuel Calicott never forgave himself. History never spoke her name again. And the most brilliant mind of the 19th century vanished without a trace, not because she was impossible, but because she was inconvenient.